A desperate dog appears on the property of a lonely millionaire carrying a dying puppy in her mouth. In an unexpected gesture, she places it at the man's feet, pleading for help. What the man does next is unbelievable. The Hawthorne mansion stood imposingly on the highest hill of Sun Valley, like a solitary castle dominating the Arizona landscape. Its pink sandstone walls guarded the secrets of its sole inhabitant, Alexander Hawthorne, a man whose fortune was matched only by the depth of his loneliness. That October morning, as the sun began to warm the lands of Arizona, Alexander performed his usual routine. He woke up at exactly 6 o'clock, as he had done for the past 5 years. Since he decided to distance himself from the business world that had given him so much, and at the same time had taken everything away. "Do you need anything else, Mr. Hawthorne?" asked Teresa, the housekeeper, as she served coffee on the main terrace. "No, Teresa. You may go," he replied without looking up from the newspaper he pretended to read. Teresa, who had been working for the Hawthorne family for more than 2 decades, sighed discreetly. She remembered the times when the mansion vibrated with laughter and conversations, when Mr. Alexander was different before the betrayal of his partner and best friend, Richard Valentine, transformed him into this shadow of what he once was. Alexander waited for Teresa to leave before setting the newspaper aside. His brown eyes, framed by some premature grey hair, were lost on the horizon. At 45, he had managed to multiply the family fortune thanks to his business vision, but success had a bitter taste in loneliness. The cool morning breeze gently moved the silk curtains, bringing with it the aroma of the rose bushes his mother had planted decades ago. It was time for his morning walk, the only time of day when he truly felt at peace. "Good morning, sir," greeted George, the gardener, as he pruned the bushes near the main fountain. Alexander responded with a barely perceptible gesture. The mansion's employees were already accustomed to his terseness, to that silence that seemed to envelop him like a second skin. He began his tour of the property's paths, a routine he followed with military precision. First, he skirted the artificial lake, then climbed up to the natural viewpoint that offered a panoramic view of the valley, and finally returned along the path that crossed the small oak forest. His thoughts, as always, wandered between memories of the past. The image of Richard Valentine, his former partner, appeared in his mind like a dark shadow. They had been friends since college, almost brothers, until Richard orchestrated an elaborate scam that nearly destroyed the family business. Alexander managed to save the Hawthorne empire, but the emotional cost was devastating. "Trust is a luxury I can't afford," he muttered to himself as his steps led him deeper into the property. The morning sun drew patterns of light between the tree branches, creating a natural spectacle that Alexander barely noticed. Teresa watched from one of the mansion's windows, worried about her employer. "Mr. Alexander needs something to wake him from this lethargy," she commented quietly to Maria, the cook. "Or someone," replied Maria, who had been working at the mansion for as long as Teresa. "I remember when he was a young man full of ideas and hopes, always talking about projects, about making the world a better place." The two women fell silent as they watched Alexander disappear among the trees. They didn't know that on that day, that so meticulously established routine was about to be interrupted by an encounter that would change not only Alexander Hawthorne's life, but that of everyone around him. The wind began to blow harder, moving the treetops and creating a whisper that seemed to presage changes. In the distance, beyond where the millionaire's gaze reached, something moved among the bushes, slowly approaching its encounter with destiny. The path narrowed as Alexander advanced towards the most remote part of his property. It was an area he rarely visited, where nature grew wilder and freer. The sound of his steps on the dry leaves broke the morning silence when something caught his attention. An unusual movement among the bushes made him stop. His eyes, accustomed to looking for out-of-place details in contracts and financial balances, focused on a spot among the vegetation. At first he saw nothing, but then he saw her, a medium-sized dog with dirty and worn golden fur staring at him from a distance. "How did you get in?" Alexander muttered, more to himself than to the animal. The property was completely fenced, and George regularly made sure there were no breaches in security. He took a step forward, and the dog retreated slightly, but without taking her eyes off him. There was something in her gaze that deeply disturbed him. It wasn't fear he saw in those amber eyes, but a silent plea that disconcerted him. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly, surprising himself by talking to an animal. He, who barely exchanged words with his employees, was trying to communicate with a stray dog. The dog tilted her head as if understanding his words and took a hesitant step towards him. It was then that Alexander noticed she was limping slightly. Her fur, though dirty, revealed prominent ribs under the skin. It was evident that she had been on the streets for a while, struggling to survive. A weak sound, barely audible, caught his attention. The dog quickly turned towards some nearby bushes and began to emit a soft whimper. Alexander, moved by a curiosity he hadn't felt in years, approached cautiously. What he saw chilled his blood. Next to a small mound of dry leaves, a tiny puppy lay motionless. Its fur, a mixture of white and gold like its mother's, was covered in dirt and its breathing was barely perceptible. "My God," whispered Alexander, completely forgetting his usual composure. The puppy couldn't be more than a few weeks old, and its condition was critical. The dog approached the puppy, and with a delicacy that contrasted with her deteriorated appearance, gently picked it up between her teeth. Alexander held his breath, waiting to see what the animal would do. To his astonishment, the dog approached him and, with infinite care, deposited the puppy at his feet. The gesture left him paralyzed. In his years running companies, he had seen all kinds of manipulations and strategies, but this was different. It was pure, sincere, desperate. The dog now looked at him with an intensity that seemed to pierce his soul, as if she understood that he was the last hope for her offspring. "Mr. Hawthorne," George's voice startled him. The gardener had approached after seeing him standing still for so long in one place. "Is everything all right?" Alexander looked at the gardener, then at the dog, and finally at the puppy that was barely moving. At that moment, something inside him, something he thought he had lost long ago, stirred. "George, I need you to call the town veterinarian immediately," he ordered, as he carefully bent down to pick up the puppy. "Tell him it's an emergency." The dog followed his every movement, her body tense but showing no aggression. When Alexander lifted the puppy, wrapped in his expensive cashmere coat, she stuck close to his legs, as if escorting him. "And George," Alexander added as he began to walk back to the mansion, "prepare the shed next to the kitchen. We'll need a warm, safe place." The gardener nodded, surprised by the change in his employer's attitude. As he watched them walk away, the millionaire, the puppy in his arms, and the dog faithfully following him, a small smile formed on his sun-weathered face. Teresa, who had been watching the scene from the kitchen window, quickly crossed herself. "Holy Virgin," she murmured, "something is finally happening in this house." The Hawthorne mansion, normally immersed in an almost sacred silence, was buzzing with unusual activity. Teresa ran from one side to the other, preparing clean towels and hot water, while Maria cleared a space in the kitchen, ignoring Alexander's protests about keeping the animals in the shed. "With all due respect, sir," Teresa said, with a firmness that only years of service allowed her, "that shed is no place for a puppy in this condition. The kitchen is warmer and we can take better care of it." Alexander, still holding the small bundle wrapped in his coat, found himself yielding to his housekeeper's logic. The dog, who hadn't separated from him for a moment, remained alert, her eyes moving between her offspring and the humans who now decided their fate. The sound of a vehicle approaching on the gravel path announced the arrival of the veterinarian. George quickly guided him to the kitchen, where Dr. Gabriel Ross, a man in his 60s with a thick grey beard and lively eyes, assessed the situation with a single glance. "Well, well," muttered the veterinarian, adjusting his glasses as he examined the puppy. "How long has it been like this?" "We found it less than an hour ago," Alexander replied, surprising himself with the concern in his voice. "The mother brought it to me." Dr. Ross looked up, intrigued. He knew the reputation of Mr. Hawthorne, the reclusive millionaire who had turned his mansion into a fortress of solitude. This behavior didn't fit with the rumors circulating in town. "It's a case of severe malnutrition," he explained as he examined the puppy. "It also has a respiratory infection and is dehydrated. The next 24 hours will be crucial." The dog approached the veterinarian, sniffing his hands as he worked. Dr. Ross observed her with professional interest. This mother has done an incredible job keeping her puppy alive. She must have traveled miles seeking help. Teresa, who had been holding back tears, couldn't help a small sob. Maria squeezed her shoulder in support as they watched the veterinarian prepare a series of injections. It will need constant attention, continued Dr. Ross, feeding every 2 hours, medications and lots of warmth. He paused, looking directly at Alexander. Are you sure you want to take on this responsibility, Mr. Hawthorne? I can take them to the clinic. They stay, interrupted Alexander with a firmness that surprised everyone present. Teresa and Maria can help with the care, and we have more than enough space. The veterinarian nodded, hiding a smile under his thick beard. In that case, I'll need to make daily visits to monitor their progress, and the mother also needs medical attention. The dog, as if understanding they were talking about her, sat next to the makeshift bed they had prepared for her puppy, maintaining a silent vigil. Doctor, Alexander called as the veterinarian prepared to leave, after leaving detailed instructions and medications. What are the chances? In my experience, Mr. Hawthorne, Dr. Ross interrupted gently, the odds depend as much on medical treatment as on the love and care they receive. And from what I've seen today, he looked meaningfully at the dog and then at the mansion's employees. This little one has more support than anyone could wish for. After the veterinarian left, Alexander found himself sitting in a kitchen chair, something he hadn't done in years. Teresa served him a cup of coffee without him asking, while Maria organized the medications and prepared the first bottle for the puppy. You know something, sir? Said Teresa as she adjusted the heating temperature. Your mother always said that angels sometimes come in unexpected forms. Alexander didn't respond, but his eyes rested on the dog, who had rested her head near the puppy, her amber eyes now calmer, as if she had finally found a safe refuge. For the first time in many years, the Hawthorne mansion seemed less like a prison and more like a home. Night fell on the Hawthorne mansion, bringing with it a storm that no one had foreseen. Lightning intermittently illuminated the kitchen, where Alexander remained seated next to the puppy, obsessively consulting the instructions left by Dr. Ross. Sir, Teresa insisted for the third time, I can stay to take care of it. You should rest. It's not necessary, Alexander replied, surprising himself. You've worked enough for today. Go home to your family. Teresa exchanged a meaningful look with Maria, who was preparing more bottles for the night. In 15 years, it was the first time her employer had shown concern for her personal life. At least let me prepare enough coffee before I leave, offered Maria, hiding a smile as she moved around the kitchen. And I've left hot food in the oven for you and for... She paused, looking at the dog who hadn't moved from her puppy's side. Luna, Alexander said softly. I think we'll call her Luna. The dog raised her head upon hearing the name, her amber eyes shining with an intensity that seemed to illuminate the entire kitchen. After the employees left, Alexander found himself alone with his new companions. The silence of the mansion, which before had seemed comforting to him, now seemed to amplify every small sound. The labored breathing of the puppy, the wind hitting the windows, Luna's occasional soft whimper. At 10 o'clock at night, as he prepared the next bottle, a particularly loud thunder shook the mansion. The puppy shuddered and began to tremble violently. No, 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 Alexander muttered, carefully picking up the little one. Luna immediately stood up, her eyes full of concern. It's okay, he told her, surprised by the naturalness with which he spoke to her. I've got it. He remembered Dr. Ross's words about keeping the puppy warm. Without thinking twice, he took off his cashmere sweater and wrapped the little one in it. The contact with the animal awakened in him a long-buried memory, a rainy afternoon from his childhood, when he found an injured cat in the garden of his old house. On that occasion, he had run excitedly to show his father his find, hoping to be able to keep the animal. The response had been emphatic. The Hawthornes don't waste time with stray animals. The cat had ended up in a shelter, and something inside little Alexander had withered that day. A lightning bolt illuminated the kitchen, bringing him back to the present. The puppy had calmed down a bit, but its breathing was still irregular. Luna approached and began to gently lick her offspring, as if wanting to infuse it with strength. You're going to be okay, little one, whispered Alexander, surprised by the lump that formed in his throat. This time will be different. The hours passed slowly. At midnight, he tried to contact Dr. Ross, but the storm had knocked down the phone lines. The puppy alternated between moments of calm and crises that tested Alexander's nerves. During one of these crises, while holding the little one against his chest, he began to unconsciously hum an old lullaby his mother used to sing to him. Luna raised her head, her eyes fixed on him, as if approving of the gesture. "You know, Luna," he said softly, "I haven't sung in years. I didn't even remember I knew this song." Dawn found them exhausted but victorious. The puppy had survived the most critical night, and its breathing, though still weak, had stabilized. Alexander, with wrinkled clothes and disheveled hair, presented an appearance that would have scandalized his business partners. When Teresa arrived early in the morning, she stopped short at the kitchen door. The powerful Alexander Hawthorne was dozing in a chair, with the puppy wrapped in his cashmere sweater and Luna leaning against his legs. On the table, a series of used bottles and scribbled notes told the story of a night of vigil. "Holy Mary," whispered Teresa, crossing herself for the second time in 2 days. As she quietly began her morning tasks, a smile lit up her face. Perhaps after all, miracles did exist. Dr. Ross arrived early that morning, carrying his worn leather bag and a smile that widened at the scene in the kitchen. Alexander, who would normally already be impeccably dressed and working in his office, was still in the same clothes from the day before, preparing a bottle with the precision of a chemist in his laboratory. "I see we've had a busy night," commented the veterinarian as he examined the puppy. Luna, now more confident with the doctor, watched every movement without moving from her offspring's side. "There were some difficult moments," Alexander replied, suppressing a yawn. "But he seems to be breathing better." Dr. Ross nodded as he performed his checkup. "Indeed, the infection is subsiding. However," he paused, adjusting his glasses, "there's something that concerns me. He'll need more specific medications and some studies that I can't perform here." "What do you suggest?" asked Alexander, visibly tensing. "There's a specialized clinic in the city. It's run by Dr. Caroline Valentine, one of the best veterinarians in the country. She has the necessary equipment and—" "Valentine?" interrupted Alexander, his face darkening. "Does she have any relation to Richard Valentine?" Dr. Ross, surprised by the change in his interlocutor's tone, nodded slowly. "She's his sister, but they haven't been in contact for years. In fact, she was the one who reported the irregularities in her brother's operations." Alexander remained silent, processing the information. Caroline Valentine. He vaguely remembered hearing about her during the scandal that almost destroyed his company, but he had never connected the pieces. "Mr. Hawthorne," continued Dr. Ross gently, "I understand your reluctance, but the puppy needs specialized care. Dr. Valentine is not only brilliant in her field, but she also runs a rehabilitation program for abandoned animals." At that moment, the puppy emitted a small whimper, and Luna began to lick it with concern. Alexander observed them, feeling how his prejudices were confronting a new reality that he hadn't asked for, but that somehow had arrived to change his life. "Teresa," he finally called, "please prepare the car." The trip to the city was an adventure in itself. Luna flatly refused to separate from her puppy, and after several failed attempts, Alexander decided to take her too. So for the first time in years, Mr. Hawthorne's elegant black Mercedes was transporting 2 dogs, one of them covered in mud. The Valentine Veterinary Clinic turned out to be a modern 2-story building surrounded by green areas. At the entrance, a discreet sign announced, "Second Home, Animal Rehabilitation Center." As soon as they crossed the door, they were greeted by a woman in her 40s, with her hair tied back in a ponytail and an impeccable white coat. Her eyes, of an intense green, lit up upon seeing Dr. Ross. "Gabriel, you didn't tell me you were coming," she exclaimed with a smile that froze upon recognizing his companion. "Mr. Hawthorne." "Dr. Valentine?" Alexander responded coldly. The silence that followed was interrupted by a whimper from the puppy. Immediately, Caroline's face changed, her professionalism overcoming any personal discomfort. "Come to the emergency room," she indicated, guiding them down a hallway. "Gabriel, can you update me while I prepare the equipment?" While the veterinarians discussed the case, Alexander observed the clinic. The walls were decorated with photos of recovered animals and their success stories. In one corner, a group of volunteers worked with dogs in rehabilitation. Everything breathed an air of dedication and hope that seemed strangely familiar to him. "Mr. Hawthorne," Caroline's voice pulled him from his thoughts, "I'll need to perform some urgent studies. You can wait in the reception area if you wish." "I'm staying," he responded without hesitation, surprising himself. Luna, who hadn't separated from him since they arrived, rested her head against his leg as if approving his decision. Caroline nodded, a small smile appearing on her lips. Very well. Dr. Ross, will you help me with the analyses? As he watched them work in perfect synchrony, Alexander felt that something was beginning to change within him. Perhaps, he thought as he absent-mindedly stroked Luna, it was time to learn to see beyond surnames and prejudices. The hours at the clinic passed slowly, while Caroline and Dr. Ross conducted the necessary analyses. Alexander, seated in a corner of the emergency room with Luna by his side, watched every movement attentively. His mind, accustomed to analyzing business situations, now tried to reconcile the image of this dedicated woman with the surname that had caused him so much harm. The results are better than I expected, Caroline finally announced, removing her latex gloves. The infection is subsiding, but he'll need a specific treatment and constant monitoring. I'll make the necessary arrangements for him to stay at the clinic, Alexander responded, tensing at the idea of separating from the puppy. That won't be necessary, Caroline intervened, surprising him. I can provide you with the treatment and detailed instructions. Besides, she paused, looking meaningfully at Luna. Separating a mother from her offspring at this point could be counterproductive. Dr. Ross hid a smile as he organized his instruments. Caroline, why don't you show Mr. Hawthorne the facilities while I prepare the medications? Before Alexander could protest, Caroline was already walking towards the door, gesturing for him to follow. Luna, after making sure her puppy was in good hands, accompanied them. This center, Caroline began as they walked through the corridors, started 5 years ago, right after the scandal with my brother. Her voice tensed slightly at the mention of Richard. I sold everything I had, including my part of the family inheritance, to build it. Alexander looked at her in surprise. Why are you telling me this? Because you, more than anyone, deserve to know the whole truth, she replied, stopping in front of a wall full of photographs. Each of these animals has a story of overcoming, but also of betrayal. Like you and me, they were abandoned by those who should have protected them. Her words hit Alexander with unexpected force. Caroline pointed to a particular photo, a German shepherd with a noble look. This is Rex. He was a police dog that was abandoned after being injured in service. No one wanted to invest in his recovery. Her eyes shone with determination. Now he helps in therapies with autistic children. They continued the tour, and each story Caroline shared revealed not only her passion for her work, but also a deep understanding of pain and recovery. Luna followed them attentively, as if comprehending the importance of each word. When I discovered what Richard was doing, Caroline continued, her voice barely a whisper, I didn't hesitate to report him. He was my brother, yes, but what he was doing was wrong. He was destroying lives, destroying trust. She stopped in front of a window that overlooked a patio where several dogs were playing under the supervision of volunteers. I lost my family that day. My father never forgave me for betraying my brother, but I gained something more valuable, the freedom to do the right thing. Alexander observed her in silence, seeing for the first time beyond the Valentine surname. This woman had sacrificed everything for her principles, just as he had sacrificed his trust in humanity to protect his family's legacy. You know something curious, Mr. Hawthorne, said Caroline, turning to him with a sad smile. When everything blew up, I wanted to contact you. I wanted to explain that not all Valentines were like Richard. But then I saw how you isolated yourself from the world, how you built those walls around you, and I understood that some wounds need time to heal. Luna, who had been listening attentively, approached Caroline and rested her head against her hand in a surprisingly tender gesture. The doctor knelt to pet her, and for a moment Alexander saw in her not the sister of his enemy, but a woman who, like him, had learned to rebuild herself from the ashes. The puppy will need daily checkups, said Caroline, recovering her professional tone. I can go to your mansion, or if you prefer, you can bring him here. We'll come here, Alexander replied, surprising them both. Luna seems to trust you, and I've learned to respect her judgment. The silence that followed was loaded with meaning. Somewhere in the clinic, a dog barked happily, and the sound seemed to break the tension of the moment. Doctor? Valentine, Alexander added as they returned to the emergency room. Thank you for sharing your story. Caroline nodded, understanding that those words meant much more than a simple courtesy. As she watched Alexander reunite with the puppy, who already showed signs of improvement, she couldn't help but think that perhaps, just maybe, second chances existed for everyone. The following days brought a surprising transformation to the Hawthorne mansion. The kitchen, once a space of silent efficiency, had become the beating heart of the house. Teresa and Maria had reorganized their schedules to ensure that someone was always watching over the puppy, whom they had started calling Hope, although Alexander had not yet officially approved the name. "More coffee, sir?" Teresa asked one morning as Alexander reviewed some documents at the kitchen table, with Luna dozing at his feet. "Yes, thank you," he replied distractedly, without looking up from the papers. In his lap, Hope slept peacefully, wrapped in a soft blanket that Maria had specially knitted for her. The sound of a car approaching on the gravel driveway announced Dr. Valentine's arrival for the daily checkup. Luna immediately raised her head, recognizing the sound of the engine. "Good morning," Caroline greeted as she entered, carrying her medical bag. She paused for a moment, surprised by the domestic scene before her. The powerful businessman Alexander Hawthorne, in jeans and casual shirt, working in the kitchen while caring for a puppy. "Doctor," Alexander responded, trying to maintain his professional composure despite the situation. "Coffee?" "Please," she accepted, as she began to prepare her instruments. "How did our little patient spend the night?" "Better," Teresa intervened, serving the coffee. "She's taking more milk now and her sleep periods are longer." Caroline proceeded with the examination, while Alexander watched every movement attentively. The initial tension between them had begun to dissolve, replaced by a mutual respect born from their shared concern for the animals. "The evolution is excellent," Caroline finally announced. "The infection has almost completely disappeared and she's gaining weight. Luna has done an extraordinary job as a mother." As if understanding the compliment, Luna wagged her tail softly. Her coat, once dull and dirty, now shone thanks to Maria's care, who had turned out to be an expert in canine grooming. "However," Caroline continued, and something in her tone made Alexander tense, "there's something I need to discuss with you, Mr. Hawthorne." Before she could continue, George appeared at the kitchen door, his normally serene face showing signs of concern. "Sir," he interrupted urgently, "Mr. Henderson is at the entrance. He says he needs to speak with you immediately." Alexander frowned. Frank Henderson was the owner of the neighboring property, a man known for his difficult temper and his obsession with maintaining order in the area. "Teresa, can you take care of Hope?" Alexander asked, carefully handing the puppy to the housekeeper. He paused for a moment, realizing it was the first time he had used the name the women had chosen. "Would you like me to accompany you?" Caroline offered, noticing the tension in the air. "That won't be necessary," he replied, although something in his tone suggested he appreciated the offer. "Luna, stay here." But Luna, who seemed to sense the unease in the air, got up and followed him to the door. Alexander didn't have the heart to stop her. In the foyer, Frank Henderson waited with a stormy expression. He was a burly man, dressed in expensive country clothes and with an attitude that suggested he was used to getting his way. "Hawthorne," he growled without preamble, "we need to talk about those stray dogs you're harboring." The temperature in the foyer seemed to drop several degrees. Teresa and Maria, who had discreetly peeked out to listen, exchanged worried glances. Caroline, who had remained in the kitchen doorway, held her breath. Alexander, however, maintained his composure, though his eyes had hardened. "What about them, Henderson?" "That bitch," he spat the words with contempt, "has been causing problems on my property for weeks. She destroyed part of my garden and scared my purebred horses. I demand you get rid of her immediately." Luna, as if understanding they were talking about her, pressed closer to Alexander's legs, her eyes fixed on the unwelcome visitor. The silence that followed was dense, charged with a tension that threatened to explode at any moment. And then, to the surprise of everyone present, Alexander Hawthorne smiled. Alexander Hawthorne's smile, far from being conciliatory, had an edge that everyone present could perceive. It was the smile that his adversaries in the boardroom had learned to fear, but now it was charged with something more, a determination that was born not from business ambition, but from something deeper and more personal. "Henderson," he began, his voice controlled but firm, "I appreciate you coming personally to express your concern. However, I must correct some points in your argument." He moved slightly, positioning himself protectively in front of Luna, who maintained a silent dignity in the face of the accusations. "First of all, these animals are not strays. They are legitimate residents of my property and are under my protection. Secondly," he continued as Henderson visibly reddened. "If you have any complaints about damage to your property, I suggest you present concrete evidence. As a businessman, I'm sure you understand the importance of proof in any claim." Caroline, observing from the kitchen door, couldn't help a small smile. This was a side of Alexander Hawthorne she hadn't seen before, the skilled negotiator, using his abilities not to destroy, but to protect. "Evidence!" Henderson bellowed, taking a threatening step forward. "My word should be enough! Or are you suggesting I'm lying?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Alexander replied calmly. "I'm simply stating the facts. And the fact is that Luna has been under constant supervision since she arrived here. In fact," he made a significant pause, "we have veterinary records documenting her health status and location for the past few weeks." Caroline stepped forward, understanding her role in this strategy. "That's right," she confirmed with professional authority. "As the veterinarian in charge of the case, I can certify that both Luna and her puppy have been under constant observation and care." Henderson looked between them, disconcerted by this unexpected resistance. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "Since when did the great Alexander Hawthorne become a defender of stray dogs? What would your business partners say?" "They would say," a new voice intervened from the door, "that I'm finally honoring the true legacy of my family." Everyone turned to see Teresa, who was holding a silver frame in her hands. She approached and handed it to Alexander, who looked at it with surprise, recognizing the photograph. His mother, young and smiling, surrounded by animals in the mansion's old garden. "Your mother," Teresa explained in a soft but firm voice, "maintained an informal shelter right here. She helped all the animals she could. She was known in town as the Angel of the Homeless." Alexander caressed the frame with trembling fingers. How had he forgotten that part of his history? Memories began to flow, afternoons helping his mother feed cats, limping dogs that miraculously recovered under her care, laughter and barks filling the garden. "Mr. Henderson," he finally said, his voice charged with an emotion that surprised everyone. "Not only will I not get rid of Luna and Hope, but I plan to continue the work my mother began so many years ago." He bent down to pet Luna, who had remained noble and serene throughout the confrontation. "If you have any future concerns, I suggest you channel them through the appropriate channels. My lawyer will be delighted to assist you." Henderson opened his mouth to protest, but something in Alexander's expression stopped him. Perhaps it was the determination in his eyes, or maybe the silent but firm presence of everyone present, backing his decision. "This isn't over, Hawthorne," he growled, turning towards the door. "On the contrary," Alexander replied with a genuine smile, "I think it's just beginning." After Henderson left, a contemplative silence filled the foyer. Caroline approached Alexander, who was still looking at the photograph of his mother. "She was an extraordinary woman," she commented softly. "She was," he replied, looking up. "And she was right about so many things. You know, Dr. Valentine, I think I'll need your professional advice for more than just Luna and Hope's care." "Oh?" Caroline raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "If we're going to reopen my mother's shelter," Alexander smiled, "we're going to need to make some changes around here." The following week brought feverish activity to the Hawthorne mansion. Property plans were spread out on the dining room table, while Alexander and Caroline discussed possible locations for the new shelter spaces. Luna and Hope, the latter now stronger and more active, rested nearby, like silent supervisors of the project. "The area by the lake would be perfect for exercise and rehabilitation," Caroline pointed out, leaning over the plans. "The terrain is flat, and the water could be therapeutic for some cases." Alexander nodded, aware of Caroline's proximity and the subtle scent of jasmine emanating from her hair. "Teresa mentioned that my mother used to use the old stables for animals that needed recovery," he commented, pointing to another area on the map. "The stables," Caroline exclaimed enthusiastically. "With some modifications, they could be turned into a perfect space for—" She was interrupted when Hope, who had been exploring with wobbly steps, stumbled and fell near their feet. Both Caroline and Alexander instinctively bent down to help her, their hands meeting for a moment over the puppy's soft fur. "I'm sorry," they muttered in unison, withdrawing their hands as if they had touched fire. Luna, observing the scene, tilted her head with what seemed to be canine amusement. Maria, who was entering with a coffee tray, hid a knowing smile. Some coffee for the architects? She offered, breaking the moment of tension. Thank you, Maria, Alexander replied, grateful for the interruption. How are the preparations for the outdoor kitchen area coming along? George and the workers are making good progress, Maria reported as she served the coffee, although George insists we'll need more help if we want to have everything ready before the rains come. Caroline took her cup, thoughtful. I have some volunteers at the clinic who would be delighted to help. They're very dedicated veterinary students. I wouldn't want to cause any trouble, Alexander began, but Caroline interrupted him with a smile. It's no trouble. In fact, it would be excellent practical experience for them. Besides, she paused, her eyes sparkling with amusement, it would do them good to meet the famous Alexander Hawthorne and discover that he's not the ogre the rumors say he is. Ogre? Alexander pretended to be offended, though a smile tugged at the corners of his lips. Is that my reputation in the city? Oh, the rumors are much more colorful, Caroline joked. Some say you're a vampire who only comes out at night. Others claim the mansion is haunted and that... Her words were interrupted by a cheerful bark from Hope, who had managed to stand up again and was now walking more confidently towards Luna. Look at that, Caroline whispered, her face lighting up. Stronger every day. Alexander watched the puppy, remembering that first desperate night. Like all of us, he murmured, more to himself than to the others. Teresa entered at that moment carrying a dusty box. Sir, I found this in the attic. I think you'll be interested. Inside the box were photo albums, old documents, and a diary. Alexander opened it carefully, recognizing his mother's elegant handwriting. It's her shelter diary, Teresa explained. She kept detailed records of every animal she helped, their treatments, their stories. Caroline approached, curious but respectful. This is a treasure trove of information, she commented softly. Her experience could be invaluable for what we're planning. Alexander turned the pages reverently, discovering a facet of his mother he had forgotten. Among the diary entries he found photographs, recipes for natural remedies, and notes about each animal that had passed through her hands. My father, he began, his voice hoarse with emotion, always said this was a waste of time and resources, that the Hawthorns shouldn't concern themselves with these things. Caroline gently placed her hand over his. Parents aren't always right, she said softly, and Alexander knew she was thinking of her own family too. No, he agreed, turning his hand to intertwine his fingers with hers. Sometimes we have to find our own path. Luna approached, resting her head on Alexander's knees, while Hope attempted to climb Caroline's legs. The moment was charged with an intimacy that went beyond words. Teresa and Maria exchanged knowing glances before discreetly withdrawing, leaving the peculiar family in their moment of discovery and connection. In the air floated the sensation that something new was being born in the Hawthorne mansion, something that went beyond a simple animal shelter. The transformation of the Hawthorne mansion progressed steadily. The old stables began to take on new life under the expert hands of workers and enthusiastic volunteers from Caroline's clinic. The sound of hammers and saws mixed with youthful laughter and occasional barks, creating a symphony that hadn't been heard on the property for years. That morning, Alexander observed the progress from the terrace, with a cup of coffee in hand and Hope dozing at his feet. The puppy had grown considerably in recent weeks, her coat now shiny and her eyes full of life. The students have finished the first section of the stable, Caroline announced, climbing the terrace steps. They're really dedicated. They are, Alexander agreed, offering her a cup of coffee, though I suspect it has a lot to do with their teacher. Caroline smiled, accepting the cup. Are you flirting with me, Mr. Hawthorne? Before Alexander could respond, Teresa appeared with a worried expression. Sir, you have a call. It's Mr. Arthur Valentine. The atmosphere on the terrace changed instantly. Caroline paled at hearing her father's name, while Alexander visibly tensed. My father, Caroline whispered. How did he know? I'll take the call in the study, Alexander decided, his voice regaining that formal tone he had begun to abandon in recent weeks. Luna, who had been resting in the study, Alexander took a deep breath before picking up the phone. Hawthorne speaking. Alexander. Arthur Valentine's voice sounded exactly as he remembered it, authoritative and cold. I've received interesting news about your current project. How can I help you, Arthur? I don't like people playing with my family's name, Arthur responded directly. First Caroline with her charity clinic, and now you turning the Hawthorne mansion into a shelter for stray animals, and to top it off, involving my daughter in all this. Caroline is a respected professional, Alexander replied, controlling his anger. And decisions about my property are exclusively mine. Like the decisions that led to Richard's downfall were yours. Arthur's voice dripped with venom. My son may have made mistakes, but it was Caroline who betrayed him, and it was you who completely sank him. Luna, sensing Alexander's tension, approached and rested her head on his knee. The gesture gave him strength to stay calm. Your son tried to destroy my company, Arthur. Caroline did the right thing by reporting his illegal activities, and if you're calling to threaten or intimidate, I'm calling to warn you, Arthur interrupted. Things are changing on the board of directors of your companies. Not everyone is happy with your new philanthropic direction. And I understand there's an important meeting next week. Alexander felt a chill. The annual board meeting. He had been so absorbed in the shelter project that he had almost forgotten about it. Thank you for your concern, he responded coldly, but my business affairs are in order. For now, the threat in Arthur's voice was barely veiled. Just remember that some people don't really change, Alexander. The Valentines will always be your enemies, even if you now pretend to play happy family with my daughter. The call ended, leaving a heavy silence in the study. Alexander remained motionless, processing the conversation, while Luna watched him with her understanding eyes. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Caroline, her face a mask of concern. What did my father want? She asked softly. Alexander looked at her, noticing for the first time how vulnerable she seemed. She was no longer the confident veterinarian who ran her clinic with a firm hand, but a daughter who had sacrificed everything to do the right thing. Nothing important, he lied, trying to smile. Just the typical threats from a Valentine. Alexander, Caroline approached, her green eyes fixed on his. Don't lie to me. Not you. The moment stretched between them, loaded with tension and unspoken truths. Hope came running into the study, breaking the moment with her youthful energy, followed by Teresa trying to catch her. I'm sorry, sir, Teresa apologized. This little mischief maker escaped while I was giving her medicine. Alexander and Caroline couldn't help but smile at the puppy's antics. For a moment, Arthur Valentine's threats seemed distant and unimportant. Caroline, Alexander finally said, making a decision. I think we need to talk. About the past, about the future, about everything. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains when Alexander and Caroline headed to the mansion's lookout point. It was a special place with a panoramic view of the valley and the gardens that Alexander's mother had designed decades ago. Luna and Hope followed them at a distance, as if understanding the importance of the moment. My father threatened the board of directors, didn't he? Caroline asked, breaking the silence as they sat on the old wrought-iron bench. Alexander nodded slowly. It seems not everyone is happy with the recent changes. I'm sorry, Caroline whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft whisper of the wind. It seems the Valentines are destined to cause problems in your life. No, Alexander replied firmly, turning to look at her. It's time we stop carrying the mistakes of our families. The sunset painted the sky in golden and pink hues, creating an almost magical atmosphere. Hope had found a particularly interesting butterfly and was chasing it through the garden, with Luna patiently watching over her antics. When I reported Richard, Caroline began, her eyes fixed on the horizon, I didn't just lose my family. I lost my identity, my place in the world. Everything I thought I knew about honor, loyalty, family, crumbled. Why did you do it? Alexander asked softly. Why risk everything? Caroline smiled sadly. You know, that same night, when I discovered the documents that proved the fraud, I found an injured dog on the street. It was alone, abandoned, suffering. I took it to my clinic, and while I was treating it, I thought about all the times I had seen signs of Richard's activities and had ignored them in the name of family loyalty. She paused for a moment, watching Luna and Hope play in the garden. That dog taught me more about integrity in one night than my family had in a lifetime. I couldn't continue being complicit in the harm Richard was causing, no matter the personal cost. Alexander listened attentively, remembering those dark days when the scandal broke. I never thanked you, he finally said. If you hadn't acted, my company would have gone bankrupt. Hundreds of employees would have lost their jobs, and now your board of directors might take control away from you for helping me with the shelter," Caroline interrupted bitterly. "The irony doesn't escape me." "It's not just your shelter, Caroline," Alexander gently took her hand. "It's our project. It's my mother's legacy. He paused, searching for the right words. "It's who I am now." The silence that followed was full of meaning. In the garden, Hope had abandoned the butterfly chase and was now dozing next to Luna under the last rays of the sun. "The board meeting is in 3 days," Alexander continued. "They're going to question my decisions, my leadership ability, probably even my sanity." "And what do you plan to do?" Caroline asked, her hand still intertwined with his. "What I should have done years ago," he replied with a determined smile. "I'm going to fight, not for money or power, but for something that really matters." He stood up, offering his hand to Caroline. "Will you help me? It won't be easy. My father, your father, the board." "Alexander," Caroline interrupted, taking his hand and standing up to face him. "Do you remember the night Luna brought hope? She didn't know if you could or would help, but she took the risk because it was the only hope for her puppy. And it changed all our lives," Alexander completed, understanding. "Exactly," Caroline smiled. "Sometimes the biggest risks bring the most beautiful rewards." The sun had almost completely disappeared, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the sky. Teresa appeared on the path, calling Luna and Hope for their dinner. "We have a lot of work to do before the meeting," Alexander said as they walked back to the mansion. "We'll need all the shelter documents, expansion plans, social impact studies, and we'll need something else," Caroline added with a gleam in her eyes. "A story to tell. A story about second chances, about redemption, about the true meaning of family legacy." As they climbed the terrace steps, Luna and Hope ran to meet them, their tails wagging happily. The mansion, which had once been a symbol of isolation and bitterness, now shone with life and purpose. "You know something," Alexander said, stopping Caroline before entering. "My mother used to say that a person's true worth isn't measured by what they possess, but by what they're willing to stand up for." "Your mother was a wise woman," Caroline replied, her hand finding his again. "And she would be very proud of the man you've become." The library of the Hawthorne mansion had been transformed into an improvised operations center. Documents, photographs, and presentations covered every available surface as Alexander, Caroline, and a small team of trusted individuals prepared their strategy for the board meeting. "The numbers are solid," explained Robert, Alexander's main accountant for the past decade. "The shelter is not only sustainable, but could generate income through specialized veterinary services and animal-assisted therapy programs." Caroline nodded, pointing to a series of graphs. "The experience at my clinic confirms this. There's a growing demand for these services, especially among high socioeconomic level families." Alexander listened attentively, absently petting Luna, who hadn't left his side all day. Hope slept peacefully in her new bed next to the desk, her presence a constant reminder of why they were fighting. "However," intervened Mary Ellen, the Hawthorne family lawyer, "we must prepare for difficult questions. The board will want to know why this drastic change in the company's direction. And why you're collaborating with a Valentine," added Robert cautiously, looking apologetically at Caroline. "About that," Caroline stood up and walked to her briefcase. "There's something you need to see." She pulled out an old folder, its edges worn by time. "I found this among my mother's things after she passed. I think it's time for it to come to light." Alexander took the folder curiously. Inside were old photographs and letters. His eyes widened in surprise as he recognized 2 young women smiling at the camera, his mother and Caroline's mother. "They were best friends," Caroline explained softly. "They worked together on animal aid projects before our families drifted apart due to business differences." "What?" Alexander almost whispered, his hand trembling slightly as he passed through the photographs. "Why did I never know about this?" "Because our fathers made sure to erase that history," Caroline responded. "The last letter is from your mother, written shortly before she had to leave the shelter. She was asking my mother to take care of the animals, to not let her work be lost." Teresa, who had been listening from the door with a coffee tray, approached. "Mrs. Isabella, your mother," she said, looking at Caroline, "used to come in secret. She would bring medicines and help with the most difficult animals. She never stopped. not even when the families stopped talking to each other. Alexander stood up abruptly, walking to the window. Luna followed him, pressing her body against his legs in support. "All this time," he murmured, "I thought I was starting something new, but in reality, you're continuing a legacy," Caroline completed, approaching him. "A legacy of two women who refused to let family disputes prevent them from doing the right thing." Mary Ellen, who had been reviewing the letters, looked up. "This could be exactly what we need. It's not just a new business project. It's the continuation of a family tradition, one that unites the Hawthorne and Valentine families in a way the board won't be able to easily ignore." "And I have one more idea," Caroline added, her eyes shining with determination. "The clinic volunteers, the families we've helped, the success stories, they're all willing to speak at the meeting. We can show the real impact this work has on the community." Robert nodded enthusiastically. "And with the expansion plans we've developed, we could turn this into a social business model that other companies would want to replicate." Hope woke up at that moment, stretching lazily before walking towards Alexander and Caroline. She sat between them, looking at them with those eyes that seemed to contain all the wisdom in the world. "There's something else," said Teresa, pulling an envelope from her apron. "Mrs. Hawthorne gave this to me before she passed, with instructions to deliver it when the time was right. I think that time is now." Alexander took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter and a legal document. "It's a trust," Mary Ellen explained after reviewing it. "Your mother established a fund specifically for the continuation of the shelter. It can't be touched by the board or used for other purposes." "And the letter?" Alexander began to read aloud, but his voice broke. Caroline gently took the paper and continued reading. "Dear Alexander, if you're reading this, it means you've finally found your way back to your heart. Money and power are tools, my love, but true wealth lies in the ability to do good, to heal, to love. I trust that when the time comes, you'll have someone by your side who shares this vision. Miracles, my son, sometimes come in the most unexpected forms." The boardroom of the Hawthorne Business Group exuded an air of authority with its floor-to-ceiling windows and seemingly endless mahogany table. Board members, men and women in impeccable suits, occupied their usual places as the morning sun bathed the room in golden light. Alexander, standing at the head of the table, presented a very different image from the cold, distant executive everyone knew. His suit was still elegant, but there was something different in his posture, in his gaze, a warmth that many noted with surprise. "Members of the board," he began, his voice firm and clear, "I've called you here to present not just a management report, but a vision for the future of the Hawthorne Group." The doors of the room opened and Caroline entered, professional and elegant in her emerald green suit. Several board members exchanged glances as they recognized the Valentine surname in the presentation that began to project. "What does this mean, Alexander?" interrupted Frederick Ruiz, the oldest member of the board. "A Valentine at our board table?" "Doctor, Caroline Valentine," Alexander emphasized, "is a respected professional and a key piece in the new project we want to present." "New project?" Arthur Valentine's voice resonated from the back of the room. Everyone turned, surprised by his presence. "Is that what you call turning the Hawthorne Empire into an animal shelter?" Caroline visibly tensed at seeing her father, but maintained her composure. "If you'll allow me," she intervened in a serene voice, "the numbers speak for themselves." The following slides showed detailed financial graphs and projections. Robert, the accountant, began to explain how the project was not only self-sustainable, but opened new business lines in specialized veterinary services and innovative therapies. "Impressive," commented Elena Martinez, one of the youngest board members. "But why this radical change, Alexander? Why now?" Alexander exchanged a glance with Caroline before responding. "Because sometimes destiny shows us the path in unexpected ways." With a gesture, he indicated for Teresa to enter. The housekeeper carried with her an old photo album and several documents. Murmurs filled the room when the first images were projected. Isabella Hawthorne and Isabel Valentine together, working at the original shelter. "My mother," Alexander explained, his voice charged with emotion, "and Caroline's mother were not only partners in this project, but they kept alive a vision of unity and service, even when our families separated." Arthur Valentine stood up abruptly. This is manipulation, using the memory of our wives to— No, Father, Caroline interrupted firmly. It's the truth that you and Mr. Hawthorne tried to bury. A truth about friendship, compassion, and the true meaning of business success. Mary Ellen, the lawyer, then came forward with the trust documents. As you can see, Mrs. Hawthorne not only foresaw this moment, but protected it legally. A tense silence fell over the room as the board members reviewed the documents. Frederick Ruiz adjusted his glasses, studying each page carefully. "This is extraordinary," he finally murmured. "But Alexander, do you really believe you can handle both the business group and this project?" "I'm not alone in this," Alexander replied, looking at Caroline. "And we have an exceptional team that—" His words were interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. The doors burst open and George, the gardener, rushed in. "Mr. Hawthorne, Dr. Caroline," he exclaimed, disregarding protocol. "It's Luna. And the puppy." Caroline's face paled. "What's happening?" "You need to come immediately," George replied, catching his breath. "There's been an accident at the mansion." Alexander and Caroline looked at each other for a second. The entire presentation and the board momentarily forgotten in the face of the urgency in George's voice. "I'm sorry," Alexander said to the board, his voice firm but concerned. "But there are more important matters that require our immediate attention." "More important than the future of the Hawthorne Group?" Arthur asked disdainfully. "Yes," Alexander replied without hesitation, as he and Caroline headed for the door. "Because sometimes, gentlemen, the true value of a company isn't measured by its assets, but by its ability to do the right thing, regardless of the cost." The journey back to the mansion transpired in tense silence, interrupted only by the sound of the Mercedes engine, as Alexander drove at the highest permissible speed. Caroline, in the passenger seat, kept her eyes fixed on the road, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles were white. "George," Alexander called to the gardener in the back seat, "explain exactly what happened." "It was during the work on the new stable," George began, his voice shaky. "Luna and Hope were supervising as always. Suddenly, part of the scaffolding became unstable. There were 2 volunteers working up there." Caroline stifled a cry. "Are the volunteers okay?" "Yes, Doctor," George quickly assured. "Luna, she somehow sensed the danger. She started barking like crazy, alerting everyone. The boys were able to get down in time, but in the confusion—" The car rounded the last curve, and the mansion came into view. A small crowd had gathered near the stables, workers, volunteers, and house staff. Before the car came to a complete stop, Caroline was already jumping out. Alexander followed close behind, his heart pounding hard against his chest. "They're here!" Maria shouted, running to meet them. "This way, quickly!" She guided them to a corner of the stable where Teresa and Dr. Ross were already working. Luna lay on her side, with a wound on her hind leg, where a fragment of the scaffolding had struck her. Hope was by her side, whimpering softly and licking her mother's face. "It's not as bad as it looks," Dr. Ross assured as Caroline knelt to examine Luna. "The wound is superficial, but she'll need a few stitches and rest." Alexander approached slowly, his throat tight with emotion. Luna raised her head upon seeing him, her amber eyes bright and clear, without a hint of regret for her heroic act. "She saved those boys' lives," Teresa whispered, tears running down her cheeks. She didn't hesitate for a second. Caroline worked alongside Dr. Ross with precise professional movements, though her hands trembled slightly. "Oh, we'll need to take her to the clinic to—" "No," Alexander interrupted gently. "We'll bring everything necessary here. We're not going to separate them." As if understanding his words, Hope cuddled closer to her mother, her small body protective next to Luna's. "Mr. Hawthorne," one of the young volunteers called, approaching timidly. We wanted to thank you. If Luna hadn't been here—" "Luna taught us something important today," Alexander responded, his voice charged with emotion. "That true value isn't in the buildings we construct or the money we earn, but in the ability to act without hesitation when others need us." The sound of approaching cars caught their attention. A caravan of vehicles was approaching the mansion along the driveway. Alexander recognized the cars of the board members. "The board of directors," Caroline murmured, recognizing them too. "Alexander, you should—" "I'm not moving from here," he declared firmly, kneeling next to Luna. "If they want to make decisions about the future of the Hawthorne Group, they'll have to do it here, seeing exactly why this project is so important." The board members began to descend from their vehicles, led by Frederick Ruiz and, surprisingly, Arthur Valentine. Their expressions of bewilderment at the scene they encountered, workers, volunteers, and executives gathered around an injured dog, were evident. "Is this what you abandoned the meeting to see, Alexander?" Arthur began disdainfully. "An injured dog?" "No, Father," Caroline responded, standing up to face him. "We abandoned the meeting to be with a heroine who just saved 2 human lives without thinking twice. Something you would never understand." Luna, as if wanting to support Caroline's words, tried to stand up. Alexander gently kept her in place, tenderly stroking her head. "Stay still, brave one," he whispered. "You've already done more than enough for today." Frederick Ruiz approached slowly, observing the scene with critical but curious eyes. The other board members followed him, forming a circle around the group. "Gentlemen," Alexander said, without rising from his place next to Luna, "welcome to the true heart of the new Hawthorne Group. I couldn't have chosen a better moment for you to see exactly what I was trying to explain to you in the boardroom." The silence that followed in the stables was almost tangible. The board members observed the scene with a mix of emotions, some with evident discomfort at being in an environment so far removed from their luxurious offices, others with genuine curiosity. Frederick Ruiz stepped forward, adjusting his glasses as he observed Luna, who maintained her dignity despite the wound. Hope, sitting protectively next to her mother, looked at him with her large brown eyes. "In 50 years in the business world," Frederick began, his voice charged with unusual emotion, "I've seen all kinds of presentations, proposals, and strategies. But this," he gestured, encompassing the scene, "this is different." Elena Martinez, the youngest board member, approached and knelt next to Caroline, who was still tending to Luna. "Can I help with anything?" she asked softly. "This is ridiculous," Arthur Valentine intervened, though his voice no longer carried the same conviction. "A multinational company can't base its decisions on sentimentality over a couple of dogs." "Sentimentality?" Teresa's voice resonated with a strength that surprised everyone. The normally discreet housekeeper stepped forward, holding the old photo album. "Mr. Valentine, do you remember when your wife Isabel used to come here in secret to help? Do you remember how she and Mrs. Hawthorne worked together, believing in something greater than family disputes?" Arthur visibly paled. One of the photos had slipped from the album. It showed Isabel Valentine smiling as she bandaged the paw of an injured dog, with Alexander's mother by her side. "The numbers are excellent," Robert, the accountant, intervened, addressing the board. "But beyond that, look around you. Look at what has been built here in just a few weeks. It's not just a shelter. It's a sustainable business model that also generates real social impact." The 2 young volunteers Luna had saved timidly stepped forward. We wanted to study veterinary medicine," one of them said, "but our families couldn't afford college. The scholarship program Mr. Hawthorne and Dr. Valentine are planning would give us that opportunity." Caroline, still focused on tending to Luna, looked up at Alexander in surprise. They hadn't publicly discussed the scholarship program yet. "It's part of the complete vision," Alexander explained, meeting her gaze. "A center for veterinary training, research, and care. Not only continuing our mother's legacy, but building something new and necessary." Frederick Ruiz began to nod slowly. "Corporate social responsibility is the future of business, gentlemen. And this goes beyond simple marketing campaigns." "But the Hawthorne Group's reputation," another board member began. "Reputation?" Elena Martinez interrupted. "What better reputation than being pioneers in a business model that combines profitability with real social impact?" Luna tried to stand up again, and this time, Caroline let her. With dignity, despite the pain, the dog sat up, with Hope leaning against her. Her eyes scanned each person present as if evaluating them. "Look at her," Caroline said softly. "A few weeks ago, she was a desperate stray dog seeking help for her puppy. Today, she saved 2 lives without hesitation. Isn't that exactly what a company should aspire to be? An agent of transformation that not only generates profits, but truly improves lives?" Arthur Valentine stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the photograph of his wife. For a moment, it seemed he was going to say something harsh, but then Luna looked directly at him, and something in those amber eyes seemed to reach him. "Isabel always said," he murmured, his voice almost breaking, "that a family's true legacy isn't in their bank accounts, but in the lives they touch. The silence that followed was different from the previous one. It was no longer tense but contemplative, full of possibilities. Frederick Ruiz cleared his throat. "I believe, members of the board, that it's time to make a decision, and I suggest we make it right here, where we can clearly see the future we're choosing." 6 months later, the Hawthorne mansion was unrecognizable. The old stables had been transformed into modern veterinary facilities, and the gardens, once silent, now resonated with happy barks and visitors' laughter. The Isabella and Isabel Center for Veterinary Rehabilitation and Training had become a national reference in a short time. That spring morning, Alexander observed from his remodeled office how Luna guided a group of dogs in rehabilitation through the garden. Her leg, fully recovered, showed no signs of the accident. By her side, Hope, now grown into a beautiful young dog, helped with the smaller puppies, demonstrating the same protective instinct as her mother. "The new group of students is arriving," Caroline announced, entering the office with a cup of coffee for each of them. "And I just received confirmation. The scholarship program has been unanimously approved." Alexander smiled, remembering the board's vote that day in the stables. Frederick Ruiz had not only supported the project, but had become one of its most fervent defenders, convincing other businessmen to invest in similar initiatives. "Who would have thought?" Caroline reflected, sitting next to him. "It all started with a desperate dog seeking help for her puppy. And she saved us all in the process," Alexander added, taking her hand. "You, me, the company, even our families." It was true. The transformation had gone far beyond the shelter. Arthur Valentine, after that afternoon, had begun a slow but significant process of reconciliation with his daughter. Now he was a regular visitor to the center, especially in the room dedicated to the memory of Isabel and Isabella, where photographs told the story of a friendship that transcended family differences. Teresa appeared at the door, her eyes bright with emotion. "Sir, Doctor, you have to see this." She guided them to the main garden, where a group of children with special needs was participating in their first animal-assisted therapy session. Luna and Hope worked with them, showing extraordinary patience and sensitivity. "It's incredible," Caroline whispered, leaning on Alexander's shoulder. "Do you see that little one? It's the first time he's smiled in months, according to his mother." Dr. Ross, who was supervising the session along with a team of therapists, approached them. "Luna has a special gift with the most withdrawn children, and Hope, well, she's surpassing her mother as a therapist. Like mother and daughter," Teresa smiled significantly, looking at Caroline and Alexander. The relationship between them had blossomed naturally, like the roses Alexander's mother had planted so many years ago. Their wedding, celebrated in the center's gardens 2 months earlier, had been a symbol of the union, not just of two people, but of two legacies that should never have been separated. Alexander Caroline called Elena Martinez, now director of the center's educational program. "The new scholarship recipients are ready for orientation." As they walked towards the training area, they passed by the newly inaugurated mural. In it, 2 young women smiled alongside several animals, Isabella Hawthorne and Isabel Valentine, whose shared dream had finally come true. "You know what's most beautiful about all this?" Caroline reflected, pausing for a moment in front of the mural. "That it's never too late to do the right thing, to heal old wounds, to start anew. And sometimes," Alexander added, "we just need someone to show us the way." He looked to where Luna and Hope continued their work, transforming lives with each interaction, even if that someone has 4 legs and can't speak. The morning sun bathed the Hawthorne mansion, now a place of healing and hope. In the garden, children's laughter mixed with happy barks, creating a symphony of life and renewal. Luna, the dog who had once been desperate and alone, now led a pack of 4-legged healers, while her daughter Hope followed in her footsteps, continuing a legacy of love and service. And in the midst of it all, Alexander and Caroline looked at each other, knowing this was just the beginning. Because sometimes the greatest miracle isn't the one we seek, but the one that finds us when we least expect it, transforming not only our lives, but the lives of all those around us. The Hawthorne mansion, once a symbol of isolation and pain, had become a beacon of hope, a living testimony that love, compassion, and courage can change the world, one life at a time. And it all began with a desperate mother and her puppy, seeking help on a cold autumn morning.